Kimunga Ukombozi, Kimunga Ukombozi, Kimunga Ukombozi, divine liberty, divine liberation, divine freedom, and all that will bring for African people wherever we happen to be on the face of this earth. Karibu, welcome. You're joining us today on the last day of the history season, or as it is referred to here, in the arena of the Universal Royal African Nation, it is referred to as Afrikan HIstoria Msimu, African History Season. And we use the Kiswahili words to describe the time of year so that we can restore, reclaim, rejuvenate our vocal expressions, our linguistic form with the identifiers that we use as a matter of course, as a matter of even just highlighting what particular time it is throughout the year. And that is something that we embrace and are very enthused by. The subject, and before I get into the subject, must thank the young special ones who energized the entry into this sphere with the profound drumming and rhythmic sounds that are so much part of our African experience. The drum is a special instrument. It's not simply enjoyment, though it is that. It has profound, deep, and meaningful roots. And to have the drum welcome of this important season is special indeed. So again, thanks to the young ones for their vibrational energy and their spirit at this time. The subject then that we're going to get into today is living history in the home and beyond. That qualifier is very, very important. Not just history, but living history in the home and beyond. Let us get into this. African history, in a general sense, certainly as it's viewed in this arena, is the self-determined experiences of African souls in the then, in the time that's gone before us. African history is the self-determined experience of African souls in the now. Our experiences are still establishing and generating history as we speak. And African history is also the self-determined experiences of African souls in the tomorrows to come. So African history is the then, is the now, and is the future. It determines what it chronicles what African people have done in a self-determined way, what African people are doing now in a self-determined way, and what is projected for African people to be doing in a self-determined way in time to come. And all of that together articulates really what is a continual flow, a continual stream, a continual thrust of history as it unfolds for African souls. And the inference is that it is alive. And we'll get more into that as we go along in the presentation for this afternoon. African history is alive because African people are alive. African history lives because African people live. As African history lives, African people are living. There's a dance that takes place between the two. One chronicles the expression of the other. They're inseparable, undetached, naturally bound and interconnected as one. Living history is the purposeful missioning for African ascension. It's not static, it's not stagnant. It is ever upward, as generations before lay the basis for what generations in the now are to do, to build upon, to inherit and progress with, upwardly. And likewise, the generation, as the generation does for, as generations in the past do for us in the now, we in the now do for others that are yet to come. So again, we've got continual flow. Living African history is expressed through application of life beyond sheer record reference. Information is good. It's useful to study written material. But is written material history itself, or simply the record of history, a note of history, a memo of history? History is lived expression, construction, building, forward ascension, upward climbing, and purposeful. So if that experience is reported on, it might be useful to partake of that information. It might be useful to read and share, learn from. That's important activity, and it has its place. But history as a whole is the experience itself. That's its substance. So when we see that the record of history is skewed to be out of place or out of position or elevated beyond the experience itself, the African souls of the world certainly have work to do to restore rightful order. Here are some key challenges as we celebrate and continue to celebrate. There's still time left, even on the concluding day, to celebrate this important history season, African history season. Here are some challenges to consider. To avoid viewing history as merely an intellectual exercise, exclusive to the realms of information, and engage learning with life application for African ascension. In other words, what we do, we can empower. What we learn, we can empower ourselves with the expression of what we do. The more we do, the more we learn. The more we learn, the more we do. It's not simply intellectual processing, detached, removed, separate to life's functioning itself. Challenge indeed, but necessary nonetheless. Here's another one. To raise knowingness that African history is a self-determined expression of living rootedly in African spiritual and cultural fabric. This is true of all life's expression, naturally so for African souls. Living the African way is at the core of what self-determination is all about. And as we hold self-determined substance at the core of life, life is expressed outwardly in accordance, in relation to, as an outward thrust of. Something to consider as we celebrate this phenomena, this grand phenomena called history. Yet another challenge. To raise knowingness that African history is a continuum of then, now, and the tomorrows to come. And we've already scratched the surface on that. So I won't labor the point, but that notion that African history is a continuum is key and positions African souls in their rightful place as custodians and responsibility holders. Lastly, in this selection of key challenges, and this is not by any means exhaustive, it's not comprehensive, there are other challenges, but these are just some basic ones to highlight for this particular presentation. To bring clarity on the distinction between African history and the history that others determine to be. If African history is the experience that African souls have brought to be of their own thrust, of their own volition, then that is also true of other people. Other people, for instance, in this disruptive state that we currently find ourselves in, as a living legacy of the Ma'afa or great disaster, which contained the vile process of enslavement, colonization, and various other horrific ills. that experience was an imposed one, was determined by others, and the African souls of the world were disrupted as subjects to that experience. Therefore, that experience is not African history. It was determined by others, and Africans were unfortunately subject to it. So there's a clear distinction between the two. Someone else's endeavor, which in this case, horrific, brutal, and the natural living of African life, which African souls determine for themselves. Not the same thing. Someone else's history and African history. So these are just some highlights in terms of the challenges that we face. And as we engage with this celebratory period, it is really about life. African history, as the title of the presentation suggests, is a living history. So is this African history? Is a stack of books, stack of journals, African history? It certainly helps to study material that empowers African life. It certainly helps to know of what has been carried out before our time. But a static stack of books cannot be the living history of African souls. Surely not. Reference, yes. Useful, yes. History, living history, I would argue no. African history is alive with the African self. History lives with the souls that history is expressed from. History is being made by the soul that you see in the mirror. That's where history lives. How do African people live? And that determines how African history flourishes. So we have to look to ourselves, because that's where history lies. We harness what has been to empower ourselves in the now and pass the mantle of inheritance on to those generations yet to come, so they continue the climb, continue the rise, continue the ascent. Based on our efforts, our history making in the now. From the earliest of times, history was alive, even in spiritual conception. And here we have a depiction of ancient African order, ancient African living. You have the African king, the African queen, and the royal child to establish the standards, the foundations the living basis of how history unfolds for us. And those that are familiar with the Asa Aset drama will know the story well. And we're not going to get into too much detail with that just here. That is effort that you can make outside of this presentation. And highly recommended that is. But know that that has been the divine conception of African life from the most ancient of times. African man, African woman, African child. It is from this that springs the continual development, growth of the family tree, the family lineage, the order of life. As African man, African woman produce children, African children grow into adulthood, who in turn create unions, male and female unions that produce children, and so on. And the branches of the family tree expand, blossom, bloom, and flourish. The reference to the family tree is by no accident, because as African souls, we are a rooted people. And there is such a thing as the tree of life. The tree of life in Africa is a living tree. And it's a magnificent tree, a royal tree, if you will. Symbolic for African life being of royalty as the grand monarchs of humanity, primary people of humanity. And the tree of life in its living form, here's one example: the baobab tree. Tall, strong, magnificent. And as much of the tree as we can see at the surface level, in all of that magnificence and grandeur, there is more tree beneath the soil with its roots. There's living empowerment in this, because we see ourselves on the surface level. Do we know how deep our roots run? Can we see the symbolic reference? Ancient Africans did. They knew the power of the natural world. They didn't compete with the natural world. They didn't try and destroy the natural world. They didn't say we're better than the natural world. We are the natural world. We are at one with the natural world. And we celebrate ourselves being a part of that natural world and the wider natural world. And we did that over and over again throughout history. Our history is replete with this. And here's a single example. Bear in mind that we're looking at the tall columns of the baobab tree alongside a pathway. and compare that to reverence for vegetation and vegetational growth through architecture, African excellence, African brilliancy, African craftsmanship, African ingenuity. Yet to be surpassed, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years old. Because Africans are at one with the sacred universe, not separate to, a core part of. The baobab trees are magnificent. The tree of life, considered to be a life giver, provides shelter, provides fruit with exceptional nutrients that feed the body and sustain life, and a host of other qualities and characteristics that African souls have harnessed over the years. So much so that the tree of life, the baobab, is considered to be a tree of creation, a divine tree. It's considered to be a tree of wisdom, a tree of knowing. And they live for thousands upon thousands of years. 5,000 or so. They've been alive with us all this time. Living history. Is not the only thing from the vegetational world of growth that African people know is important energy for African empowerment. In other parts of Africa, there are various symbols. Here's one from West Africa. Nyamienti. And it means by the grace of the Creator. Reverence to natural world, the natural environment. The African people are a firm part of. Is sustenance for that excellence and that genius flow to be expressed. This is what it means to be alive. Not just breathing now, but to have living knowingness of ourselves, our environment, and our core and central position in the world. Our homes ought to be and have always been considered havens to nurture, groom African life, a sanctuary of living. And if it's not that, then surely there are changes to be made. However challenging that might be, African homes are sanctuaries, havens to cultivate, nourish, develop life and life's expression. From the order of the ancient times, we still carry that with us. We might try and suppress it, we might try and derail it, but it is there with us and surely must be fully restored. Surely must. Restoration may mean having to separate or be apart from those that cannot harmonize, those that, when brought together, create dysfunction or are abrasive, and re-establish life elsewhere. Harmonize with souls that can harmonize. Be ordered with souls that will be ordered, so that African life can flourish. African kingly men, African queenly women, African royal children. Can we express that in the now? Can we establish that in the now? And bring history to its living self? Because the African lives, so too does history. And if the African is not in a living haven, then surely that's not fullest living. So then African history cannot be fully flourishing. We make history where we stand. We establish history where we stand. Because we make our havens and establish our havens. And sure, we can talk about the physical objects that we can place in our homes that reflect ourselves, that energize us in a positive way, materials that we can have around our homes that do likewise. But that's not the focus of this particular presentation today. We're looking at the importance of the self. And the importance of the self cannot be underestimated for the African. That special soul, that primary soul of humanity. There are 9 parts to the African person self. 9. Not just mind and body. 9 different parts that need cultivation, development, grooming, shaping, and order in order for the person self to flourish. One of them is the ka. The spark of divine intelligence. That's beyond the physical. That's our connectedness with universal consciousness, the ultimate divine, the creator supreme. We are particles of that grand and magnificent whole. And you can see the symbol for the Ka being the outstretched hands in this way, in this manner, with the right angled elbow. Rather like the branches of a tree reaching out and upwardly. History lives. Another part of the self is the African name. You see, for age to age, from age to age, I should say, African souls have given themselves names that convey deep and meaningful substance, that have the empowering thrust of life embodied in words for a particular soul. Names aren't just selected because they sound nice. They're selected because they have that profound meaning that is carried with that soul throughout the physical lifespan and beyond. It stays. It's that important. And it's constantly uttered. In terms of a lifespan, it's probably the most common word any given soul may hear during their life. A call to that person, an acknowledgement of that person. And with that deep and meaningful name, energizing that soul with the qualities that that name expresses. So if you have a name that means one of excellence, and you hear that every day, reinforced every time you're called upon or identified, then excellence will surely come to be. Even in our interrupted or disrupted state, where African names have in recent history, recent contemporary history, been stripped and replaced with ID tags that represent the false and bogus notion that African souls are somehow property. There's a duty upon African souls in living knowingness of themselves and the livingness of their history to restore their way, restore their names, so we can name our young ones appropriately, but also for those of us in adulthood, we can reclaim, restore that which was taken away from us and was intended to render us less than. We can put that back in place. And it's highly recommended that we do that as we navigate this life that we have in the physical sense. So the African name is a firm part of the 9 parts that the person's self consists of. Self-knowingness, living history. Living history in the home is of order. There is the kingly African masculine man. There is the queenly African feminine woman, both in harmonious and complementary union, which has been with the African from the earliest of times, as we've seen from the imagery. Each with the role and responsibility for life's fullest flourishing, reflective of nature, reflective of biological functioning, reflective of qualities and characteristics that each respectively hold. Out of that union, out of the harmonious and complementary union, comes young ones. Familyhood grows. Or familyhood is restored depending on the circumstance we find ourselves in. Or familyhood is established depending on the circumstance we find ourselves in. But familyhood nonetheless, with order and harmonious complementarity. What happens in the home is not mutually exclusive to what happens in African life beyond the home. That's just basic logic, right? So we live in our havens that we've rightfully established, and we walk from those havens to amplify, amongst others, that which we already do, that which we already hold, that which we already function as being. So outside of the home, there is royal African community. If the homes that African souls leave from are havens of that royal self, befitting the grand monarchs of humanity, the primary people of humanity. This is royalty in the general sense of the word. Functioning in an upright and ordered way based upon the functioning of upright and ordered living in the home haven, in the home sanctuary. They're not exclusive, they're a firm part of. It's only scaled upward, outward, more than. It's an amplification. So we all have a responsibility as African souls in the world in this process of restoration. Surely we must do that. Restore ourselves. Surely we must. Beyond community, there is nationhood. And again, it's amplification. What goes on in the community and communities in different locations African souls gathered as amplified African families. The communities then amplified to become nation. And as nations amplify, there is then the African world community. None of these are mutually exclusive. One needs the other. The person's self cannot flourish by itself. It needs context to groom, to grow, to be fully optimal. That's what the self needs, the African self. So it's not a question of African souls shutting themselves off and locking themselves away for the duration of a lifespan, saying, I'm going to fix myself. That is anathema to being fixed. Certainly in the African world, the African old saying, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am, rings true. As we restore ourselves, establishing, developing, maintaining functional life institutions, this both continues and makes living African history. The institution of the self, restoration of our names, knowingness of our sophisticated being, and being a part of the ultimate divine force of the universe. That restoration is living history. We're making history when we do that, when we determine ourselves to be, when we restore ourselves to be. This is living history. So I hope we can see that. I hope ones and ones are able to adjust perhaps some of the contaminants that have seeped into the crevices of our minds and our beingness, that have been peddled by others that mean the African ill. Purge ourselves of those things and allow ourselves to at least consider our own self-determined possibilities. And better yet, bring them into being. Here's some recommendations, just a few. Not many, just a few. We can restore African culture. Pioneering efforts have already been made to allow restoration to take place. We have, as African souls of the world, a value system that we can use as a basic functioning of life. The Nguza Saba, 7 principles, basic level functioning. It's not the only value system we have access to, but one that allows the foundations to be set. Firm footing, firm ground to stand firm upon. The 7 principles. Umoja means unity. Kujichagulia means self-determination. Ujima means collective work and responsibility. Ujama, cooperative economics. Nia, purpose. Kuumba, creativity. And Imani, meaning faith. The foundational principle is umoja. That's the unity principle. And again, they are intertwined. They create a fabric. They're not isolated and discrete. They're interwoven. So do consider that. Restoring African culture. We restore living history. We become our self-determined selves. And rightfully so. So we restore our culture. We can also restore spiritual living, our spiritual thrust, our spirituality. And spirituality harmonizes in its natural form with the culture that we live. It's not spirituality over here and culture over here. And worse yet, they're not supposed to be conflict between the two. That's dysfunction. That's disorder. So there is spiritual functioning, which is necessary for African souls, being a spirit-endowed people, a spirit people of the world. Cultural functioning is essential to African life. The bringers of culture and civilization to the world. And the two spheres are at one in the natural scheme of things. So if we have cultural restoration taking place, and that is a must, that surely is imperative, then as well we have harmonizing spiritual order, spiritual functioning, spirituality being restored to African life. And that's where the wonderful formulation of Aswat, or African spirituality by way of Kwanzaa, comes to the fore. So we have cultural fabric in the Nguza Saba, which is at the core of the Kwanzaa celebration, that forms all year round values that African people can live by and express themselves with. And at the same time, we have spiritual functioning that harmonizes beautifully at a level that can be shared across the African world community, regardless of geographical space, regardless of local citizenship or political boundary. And shared in a way that does not negate local African traditions but operates at a shared level. Rather like having a local language and a language that you will use on the global scale. That's a basic metaphor, but hopefully that illustrates the point. And it also means that African souls have a vehicle for this shared oneness of spirituality, whether as a practitioner of local tradition or as a soul that has no specific local tradition. We can still all have our shared spiritual oneness. So this restoration of spiritual living can be engaged with in becoming familiar with and practicing ASBA, African spirituality by way of Kwanzaa. And as we restore ourselves at these various levels, as we reclaim ourselves, we're reclaiming our history. We're reclaiming our lives' expressions, our lives itself. We're reclaiming the living history that is the norm of African life. As another recommendation, be a part of an organized mission for African ascension. Order has always been with us. And remember, none of these are mutually exclusive. We're a sophisticated people that can engage in a number of things as we journey through life. We've done this all the time for others, even when they mean us no good. We can surely do it for ourselves. So a recommendation, of course, this being the Universal Royal African Nation, is to be a part of it. Find out how you can get involved and visit the website www.u-ran.org. Basic outline of what it is detailed there. Also detailed is the cultural observance calendar that is all year round, of which the history season is one of. We can restore ourselves. We can reclaim ourselves. African people must surely live. And as African people live, so too does African history. Make use of available reading and other materials. One such available resource, at least as at the time of this presentation, is the Wake Up Call online, which you can find at www.wakeupcallonline.xyz. Laden with articles, laden with information, a rich resource for the African community. Make use of that. And engage in African life. African souls must participate in their own lives, their own living, their own way, outside of an interrupted state. Such a comment would be seen as perhaps even nonsensical, because it's the norm of life to just be yourself. But in an interrupted state where we face so much that tries to shoehorn us out of ourselves, to be dysfunctional, to be involved in survival and survival only, to be setting up short-lived survival units as opposed to families. Of deep substance and meaning. We can empower ourselves with all that is available to us. Studying, learning, reading, and otherwise. With the application, with the engagement, with the traction, with the mission. We're going to bring this particular presentation to a close. And hopefully, souls will be able to glean a little bit of insight into this very important notion that African history lives because African people live. And if African people are not living, not self-determining, not being themselves, then surely African history flounders. We have a responsibility to ourselves. No one else will do this for us. This is what we have to do for ourselves. African people make African history. African people establish African history. African people are African history. That continuum of the then, the now, and the tomorrows to come. So with that, we're going to close the presentation for today with the foundation principle, as was mentioned earlier, of the Nguza Saba. That foundation principle is umoja. In the beautiful, rhythmic, spiritually and culturally rooted language of oneness referred to as Kiswahili, the summary meaning of umoja is thus: kujitahidi na kuendeleza umoja katika familia, jamii, taifa na asili. And in the bogus, rudimentary, backward, regressive, infantile, pseudo-language referred to as English, the loose approximation, because that's all it can be, is as follows: to strive for and maintain unity in the family, community, nation, and race. Whatever you do, walk good, stay strong, stay blessed, stay magnificent, stay beautiful, stay divine, stay all of those wonderful and magnificent things until such time again. Kwaheri for now. Kimunga ukombozi, Kimunga ukombozi, Kimunga ukombozi. Divine liberty, divine liberation, divine freedom, and all that will bring for African people wherever we happen to be on the face of this earth.